A racist officer shoots an elderly black man holding a newborn baby, but what happens next will leave you speechless. The evening air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and weighed heavy on the lungs. James Holloway stepped out of the grocery store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him with a quiet hiss. The parking lot stretched before him, the asphalt still radiating the heat of the day, even as the sun had begun its slow descent beyond the horizon. He walked carefully, deliberately, his every step measured, not out of age, but out of habit. He had lived long enough to know that a black man moving too fast, too suddenly, too carelessly could be a problem for someone looking for one. In his arms, nestled in the crook of his elbow, his newborn grandson stirred softly, barely more than a few weeks old. The tiny boy, wrapped snugly in a soft blue blanket, let out a quiet sigh, his little hands curling into delicate fists as he drifted in and out of sleep. James glanced down at him, his weathered face softening. A miracle, that's what he was. His son's firstborn, a gift that had brought new meaning to his life. Holding him felt like holding something holy, something untouched by the world's ugliness. James pulled the baby closer, adjusting his grip as he walked toward his car. His mind wasn't on the dangers of the world, not in that moment. He wasn't thinking about the warnings his own father had given him when he was young, the lessons that had been drilled into him about where he could go, how he could act, when he needed to step aside. He wasn't thinking about the times he had been mistaken for something he wasn't, a threat, a criminal, a problem that needed solving. He was only thinking about his grandson. The boy had been left in his care while his son ran a quick errand. It was nothing unusual, just a normal evening, a simple grocery run, the kind of thing that shouldn't have mattered, the kind of thing that should have been easy. James barely noticed the police car parked across the lot, but the officer inside noticed him. Officer Mark Reynolds had been watching James from the moment he stepped out of the store. He had been patrolling the area for weeks, waiting for something to happen, waiting for trouble to appear where he expected it to be. And now, his eyes locked onto the elderly black man cradling a newborn baby in his arms. His mind filled in the blanks. A kidnapping. That's what he saw. A dangerous suspect, a criminal on the run, a child in need of rescuing. Reynolds' pulse quickened, his training kicking in. They had always told him that hesitation could get you killed, that the difference between life and death was how quickly you acted, that if you had to ask questions, you were already too late. So he didn't hesitate. His hand moved to his holster, fingers tightening around the cold metal grip of his weapon. His training told him to act fast, to neutralize the threat before it escalated. James had barely reached his car when he heard the bark of a command, sharp, demanding, cutting through the quiet of the evening like a gunshot itself. His body tensed, the instinct ingrained in him through years of survival kicking in before he even processed what was happening. He turned his head, moving slowly, carefully, the way he had always been told to move when facing a man with a badge. And then the bullet ripped through his shoulder. The force knocked him backward, pain exploding through his body, a searing, burning agony that stole the breath from his lungs. His knees buckled, his balance lost as his back slammed against the hard pavement. The world tilted, blurred, his vision swimming as he gasped for air. The baby let out a piercing wail. James's arms tightened instinctively around the tiny body. The only thought in his mind now was protect him, protect him, protect him. Pain surged through his limbs, but his grip did not loosen. He held on to the baby as though his own life depended on it, because in that moment it did more shouting. The sound of boots pounding against the pavement, the ringing in his ears growing louder, drowning out everything else. His breath came in ragged gasps, the metallic taste of blood creeping into his mouth as he struggled to focus, to stay conscious. The officer loomed over him now, his gun still raised, his expression unreadable. James could barely make out the shape of him through the haze of pain and confusion. But he knew that look, the one that had been burned into his memory years ago, the look of a man who had already decided what he was looking at, a suspect, a danger, a man who needed to be put down. The baby's cries filled the space between them, sharp and shrill, a sound that should have meant something. But Reynolds' hands did not tremble. James tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. choked by pain, by disbelief, by the cruel absurdity of it all. His body was breaking, blood pooling beneath him, soaking into his shirt, into the concrete beneath his back. The heat of it spread through him, mixing with the night's humidity, making the air feel impossibly thick. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. The high-pitched screams of witnesses cut through the haze, frantic voices calling out, demanding to know why. But James knew why, and he knew that no matter what happened next, no matter how many people arrived, no matter how many cameras recorded what had just happened, it was already too late. The bullet had already left the barrel, the assumption had already been made, and the world had already decided what kind of man he was before he ever had a chance to prove otherwise. James's breath came in shallow bursts, his vision dimming as the weight of everything settled onto his chest. He could hear people rushing toward him now, paramedics, officers, bystanders, but none of it mattered anymore, because his blood was already on the pavement, and no amount of sirens could rewind the moment when Officer Reynolds pulled the trigger. James could feel the heat of the pavement against his back, the rough texture of the asphalt pressing into his skin through his blood-soaked shirt. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, every inhale sharp with pain, every exhale tinged with the coppery taste of blood. His grandson still lay pressed against his chest, his tiny body warm, his cries piercing the night air. James could feel his little fists moving, could hear the desperate wails of a child too young to understand the violence that had just unfolded around him. His arms, though weakened, remained locked in place, his hands cradling the baby with a grip that refused to break. He had taken the bullet, but the child had been spared. That was all that mattered now. Around him, the world was chaos. The officer was still shouting, his voice slicing through the humid air like a blade, barking commands that meant nothing. His words blurred together, noise upon noise, hollow orders drenched in panic. He demanded that James let go of the baby, that he comply, that he surrender, as if he were a criminal, as if he were a threat. James could hear the officer's heavy breaths, the erratic rhythm of a man whose certainty had begun to unravel. There was a tremor beneath the authority in his voice now, something almost uncertain, almost afraid. But James was not afraid. He had lived through too much to be afraid now. The bullet had already done its damage. The worst had already happened. What more could they take from him? His vision swam, blurred at the edges, the world tilting in and out of focus. He could feel the life draining from his body, the warmth of his own blood pooling beneath him, soaking into his clothes, into the pavement. He could hear the muffled voices of the bystanders, their horror cutting through the night in frantic, desperate cries. People had stopped in their tracks the moment the gunshot rang out, their evening routines shattered in an instant. Some had been too shocked to react at first, frozen in place, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. But now they were yelling, screaming at the officer, their voices rising in outrage, in disbelief, in fury. Some had pulled out their phones, the glow of their screens flickering against the darkness, cameras capturing everything. The blood, the bullet wound, the officer still gripping his gun, the child still crying against his grandfather's chest. But none of it mattered, because no one could undo what had already been done. James's body was growing weaker, his limbs heavy, the pain no longer sharp but dull and consuming. His fingers trembled, his breath came slower, his pulse thudded unevenly against his ribs, but still his arms did not waver. Arms did not. Even as the officer reached down, yanking at the child, James did not let go. He would not let go, not while he still had breath in his body, not while he could still fight. The baby's cries grew louder, his tiny body writhing against James's chest, his newborn lungs wailing in distress, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered across the officer's face. Doubt, hesitation, realization. James saw it. The slow, creeping understanding that he had made a mistake. The moment stretched, suspended in time, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The officer's grip on his weapon faltered slightly, his expression shifting, the absolute certainty he had held only moments ago now fractured. But realization was not enough. Truth could not unmake what had been done. Then came the voices of others. New officers arriving on the scene, tires screeching to a halt, doors slamming shut, more boots pounding against the pavement. Someone was yelling for paramedics. Someone else was shouting at the officer, demanding an explanation. A store clerk, still wearing his apron, pushed through the crowd, his face contorted with rage. He was screaming that James was not a criminal, that the baby was his grandson, that the officer had shot an innocent man. His voice cracked from the force of it, from the sheer disbelief that something like this could have happened in front of him. But it was too late for truth to change what had already been set in motion. James had been shot, and nothing could erase that. He could hear the sirens getting closer, could see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass windows of the store. Shadows moved over him, voices overlapping, figures rushing toward him. The world was still tilting, still slipping out of his grasp. His eyelids felt heavier now, his body sinking further into the pavement, his strength bleeding out onto the ground beneath him. He was so tired, but he would not let go. Even as gloved hands reached for him, even as paramedics shouted for oxygen, even as officers argued over what had happened, he held on. Because he had always held on. Because letting go was never an option. Because this baby, his grandson, his blood, his future, deserved to live in a world where men like James were not left to bleed out on the pavement over a lie. And as the weight of his body finally gave into the darkness, as the world around him faded to nothing but muffled sounds and blurred light, James knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would have to pry this child from his cold, dead hands before he ever let go. By the time James was in surgery, the world had already exploded in outrage. The blood had barely dried on the pavement when the first video hit social media. A shaky phone recording, grainy, frantic, but unmistakably clear. The sound of the gunshot, the cries of the baby, the gasps of onlookers. The image of an old man crumpled on the ground, his blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him, his arms still locked around his grandson. The footage traveled faster than fire, spreading through every platform, igniting a fury that could not be contained. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times. Hashtags bearing James Holloway's name flooded timelines. Celebrities retweeted it, activists dissected it, strangers across the country demanded answers. The headlines followed, his blood-stained body plastered across every screen, every news outlet, every front page. The police department was silent at first. Then, a carefully worded statement appeared. A press release written by men in suits, polished and hollow. The shooting was under review. An investigation was underway. Officer Mark Reynolds had been placed on administrative leave pending further inquiry. The words meant nothing, because there was nothing to investigate, because the world had already seen the truth. The footage did not lie. The image of James bleeding out in the street did not lie. The cries of his grandson did not lie. The officer's gun still smoking in his hands did not lie. But the rage that followed was not just about James. His shooting was a match dropped into a pile of dry kindling that had been waiting to burn. The community, already fractured from years of injustice, already seething from the weight of a system that had failed them too many times before, erupted. James's family was the first to demand justice. His son, his brothers, his nephews, his friends, they would not be quiet. They stood in front of news cameras, their voices shaking with fury and grief. They told the world who James Holloway was. They refused to let him be reduced to just another victim, just another headline, just another statistic. They spoke of the man who had raised his children with dignity, who had worked his whole life to provide, who had lived through eras of hatred and survived only to be gunned down for holding his grandson. They spoke, and the world listened. Then the streets filled. The protests began with candlelight vigils, with people gathering outside the hospital where James lay in critical condition, praying for a man they did not know but refused to forget. Then came the marches. Thousands flooded the streets, their voices rising like a storm, a force that could not be ignored. They chanted his name, held up the image of him bleeding on the pavement. Signs demanded justice, accountability, consequences. And then, the past began to unravel. The truth about Officer Reynolds started to come to light. His name had not been clean. His record had not been untouched. The department had known. There had been complaints, many complaints. Reports of racial profiling, of excessive force, of stops that had never needed to happen. He had been written up before, investigated before, cleared before, because he was always protected. Until now. Now, there was no hiding. Every past complaint against him was dragged into the daylight. Every name he had brutalized under the guise of law enforcement was spoken aloud, recorded, remembered. James Holloway was not his first victim, but now he would be his last. As the night stretched on, the protests grew louder, bolder, angrier. The police department barricaded its doors as crowds gathered outside, their chants shaking the very walls. Officials tried to plead for peace, to ask for patience, but patience had run out. The city trembled with unrest. People had been afraid before, afraid of speaking up, afraid of being next, afraid of the power men like Reynolds wielded so carelessly. But something had shifted. Because now, the people he had terrorized were no longer afraid. And for the first time in his life, Officer Mark Reynolds was. The night before the trial, Officer Mark Reynolds woke to the sound of glass shattering. His breath caught in his throat, his body snapping upright in bed, drenched in sweat before he was even fully awake. The sound had come from the front of the house, sharp, violent, deliberate. His heart pounded against his ribs as he reached for the gun on his nightstand, his fingers wrapping around the cold steel. He held it tight, his grip slick with sweat, his breath sharp and uneven as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The house was too quiet, too still. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. A presence. Something unseen. Something watching. He forced himself to stand, moving toward the bedroom door, his bare feet pressing against the hardwood floor. The air in the house felt different, heavier, as though it had been filled with something thick, something waiting. The only sound now was his own heartbeat, a steady thump, thump, thump against his eardrums as he tightened his hold on his weapon. Then, from the other room, a flicker of light. He stepped into the hallway, inching forward, his muscles coiled with tension. The television in his living room flickered to life. The sudden glow of the screen cut through the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. The static hummed softly for a moment before dissolving into a news broadcast. Reynolds' stomach twisted. Footage of James Holloway filled the screen. The hospital bed. His face lined with pain but still filled with strength. The deep wound in his shoulder, the IV drip attached to his arm, the monitors beeping steadily beside him. But what sent a chill through Reynolds' spine was the image beside him. The baby. His grandson. Alive. Safe. The child was curled against his grandfather's chest, his tiny fingers wrapped around the fabric of James's hospital gown. The weight of the moment pressed against Reynolds' chest, making it harder to breathe. He tried to look away, but his eyes refused to move from the screen. Then the footage changed. Reynolds' own face appeared. A montage of his past, every arrest, every man he had brutalized under the guise of authority, every life he had stepped on because he thought he could. Dash cam footage, body cam footage, surveillance clips. One by one, faces flashed before him. Men thrown to the ground, cuffed, beaten. Reports with his name stamped at the bottom. Complaints filed, investigations launched and then buried. No consequences, no accountability. Until now. A sick feeling twisted inside him, something cold and unfamiliar curling in his gut. He raised his gun, his hands trembling now, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. He did not understand this. The television should not have been on. He was alone. But then, a voice, not from the television, from the darkness. A whisper, low, cold, unrelenting. "You thought he was a criminal." Reynolds froze. The voice was too close. It came from the shadows beyond the television, from the blackness in the corner of the room where the light did not reach. A breath, a step closer. "Now you'll find out what it feels like to be hunted." Reynolds spun around, gun raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. But the darkness swallowed him whole, and for the first time, he knew fear.